My own son changed the locks on the house I built with these two hands, treating me like some worthless old fool who'd outlived his purpose. I'm Otis Harlan, and what I'm about to tell you. Lord knows I've carried it in my chest for too long, locked away like something shameful, when really it's just too heavy to share with folks who wouldn't understand. You know, when you get to be my age, 82 come next March if the good Lord's willing, you start to see things different. The world looks at you different too. They see the tremor in your hands when you reach for your coffee cup, the way you gotta grab the railing going downstairs, how you ask them to repeat things 'cause your hearing ain't what it used to be. What they don't see is everything you're still carrying inside, all the years that made you who you are, all the secrets you water like plants in a hidden garden. I live here in this little corner of Missouri, in a house that knows my whole story. Every creak in these floorboards remembers my Eleanor's footsteps. Every scratch on the kitchen table tells about Sunday dinners when Clyde was just a boy, back when he still looked at me like I hung the moon. Now I'm just the old man they gotta figure out what to do with, like I'm some piece of furniture that don't match their new decorating scheme. But here's what they didn't know, what nobody knew until it was time to show my hand. While they were scheming to push me out of my own life, treating me like my mind was already gone, I was sitting on something that would have made their jaws drop clean to the floor. See, for near about 50 years, I've been buying up land, little pieces here and there, places nobody wanted. And that house they stole from me, that house full of memories they thought was all I had. Well, let me tell you something ... that was just the beginning of what they didn't know about Otis Harlan. If you got a minute to listen to an old man's story, I promise you, it's one you won't forget. Hit that subscribe button, 'cause what I'm fixing to tell you, well, it's gonna take us both on quite a journey. You know, there was a time when that house was everything to me. Not because of what it was worth in dollars and cents, but because of what it held. I remember the day I laid the foundation, summer of '71, sweat dripping down my back, mixing concrete with my own hands while Eleanor sat under that big oak tree, 5 months pregnant with Clyde, fanning herself with one of them paper fans from church. She'd bring me sweet tea every hour, kiss me on my dusty forehead, and say, "Otis, you're building us a castle," and to me, it was. Every nail I hammered, every board I cut, I was building our future. The house ain't much to look at from the outside, I reckon. Just a 2-story colonial with white siding that needs painting every few years, green shutters that I installed myself, and a wraparound porch where Eleanor planted her roses. Lord, how she loved them roses. Pink ones, yellow ones, some that were near about red as blood. She'd spend hours out there, talking to them like they were her babies, pruning and watering, making sure each one got just what it needed. The whole neighborhood used to slow down when they drove by in June just to catch a glimpse of Eleanor's rose garden in full bloom. Clyde grew up in that house, and I swear every inch of it remembers him as a boy. That dent in the hallway wall from when he tried to ride his bike indoors, the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where we measured his height every birthday. He was a good boy, or at least I thought he was. Used to help me in the garage, handing me tools while I worked on cars, his little hands barely able to grip the wrenches. One day, Dad, he'd say, "I'm gonna be just like you," and I'd ruffle his hair, grease and all, believing every word. But looking back now, with these old eyes that have seen too much, I can spot the signs I missed. Like that time when Clyde was maybe 16, and I caught him going through my desk drawers. "Just looking for a pen, Dad," he said, quick as lightning. Or when he'd ask about money, always wanting to know how much the shop brought in, how much we had saved. I thought it was just a boy's curiosity about his father's business. I thought he was planning his future, wanting to follow in my footsteps. Eleanor passed in the winter of 2018. Cancer took her slow and mean, the way cancer does. But even at the end, she was thinking about her roses, making me promise to keep them watered, to deadhead them proper in the summer. "The pink ones need extra care," she whispered, her voice barely there anymore. They're sensitive, like me. I held her hand and promised, and I kept that promise every single day after she left me. That first year without her, Clyde and his wife Loretta came around more often. I thought it was sweet how they worried about me. Loretta would bring casseroles. Clyde would sit with me on the porch, not saying much but being there. I was grateful, thought I'd raised a boy who knew the value of family, who understood that you take care of your own. But then came that day in late spring, maybe 2 years after Eleanor passed. Clyde showed up with some papers, all official looking with them fancy seals and signature. "Dad," he said, sliding them across the kitchen table, the same table where he used to do his homework, "we need to talk about the future, about protecting what you and Mom built." He had this look in his eyes, earnest and concerned, like he was trying to save me from something terrible. "It's about the taxes, Dad," he explained, his voice patient like he was talking to a child. "The government, they'll take everything if we don't plan ahead. This'll put the house in my name, but it's still yours, always yours. It's just paperwork, just protection," and he pushed the pen toward me, that same hand that used to reach for my tools now reaching for my life's work. I should have known then, I should have seen it in the way Loretta stood by the door, trying not to smile. I should have heard it in the too smooth way Clyde talked, like he'd practiced them words in the mirror, but you know what? When it's your own blood sitting across from you, when it's the boy you raised and loved and would die for, you don't see the knife until it's already between your ribs. I signed them papers. God help me, I signed them with the very pen Eleanor gave me for our 40th anniversary, the one with my initials engraved on it. And Clyde, he smiled and patted my shoulder, said, "You did the right thing, Dad. Mom would be proud, but you know what haunts me most?" About a week before he brought them papers, I found him in the garage, looking through some old boxes. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was looking for pictures of Mom, but them boxes ... Them boxes didn't have no pictures. They had my old land deeds, the ones I'd been collecting since before he was born. He must have seen them, must have gotten curious. And that's when I think the seed got planted in his mind, though he didn't know the half of what I really had hidden away. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it then. That was the day my boy stopped being my boy and became something else, something hungry and calculating. But the real betrayal, the one that would leave me standing outside my own door with the locks changed and know where to go. That was still coming, and looking back, I wonder if Eleanor knew somehow. I wonder if that's why, in her final days, she kept saying, "Watch out for yourself, Otis. Promise me you'll watch out for yourself." The first time I really knew something was wrong, truly wrong, was when I came home from the grocery store on a Tuesday morning and found Loretta in Eleanor's garden with a shovel. She was digging up the pink roses, the ones Eleanor made me promise to take special care of, just ripping them out by the roots like they were weeds. I stood there holding my grocery bag, bread still warm from the bakery, watching her destroy 45 years of love and careful tending. "What in God's name are you doing?" I asked her, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. She looked up at me, dirt on her manicured hands, and you know what she said. "Oh, Otis, didn't Clyde tell you? We're modernizing the garden. These old roses are diseased. They need to go, diseased. Eleanor's roses that won prizes at the county fair that people drove miles to photograph, diseased." I dropped my groceries right there on the porch and went to stop her, but Clyde appeared from inside the house, my house, like he'd been watching from the window. "Dad," he said, putting his hand on my chest, gentle but firm, "Loretta knows what she's doing. She took a landscaping course online. A landscaping course online, like that trumped 45 years of Eleanor's knowledge, her love, her very soul that lived in that soil." That's when I noticed other things too. The curtains Eleanor had sewn, the ones with the little blue birds that matched her favorite dress, they were gone, replaced with some stark white things that looked like they belonged in a hospital. The old coffee table we'd bought at an estate sale on our 5th anniversary, refinished together in the garage, that was gone too. Piece by piece, they were erasing her, erasing us, erasing every memory that made that house a home. This is still my house, I told them, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound like the man who used to run a business, who used to have people's respect. But Clyde just smiled that patient smile, the one I was starting to hate, and said, "Of course it is, Dad, we're just helping you maintain it. You can't keep up with everything anymore. Can't keep up?" Like I was some doddering fool who couldn't tend a garden or fix a leaky faucet. This from a boy who couldn't change his own oil till he was 25, who called me every time he needed to hang a picture frame. But I bit my tongue, swallowed my pride like bitter medicine, because what else could I do? Make a scene in front of the neighbors, prove to everyone that I was the difficult old man they were starting to whisper I was. See, that's the thing about getting old that nobody tells you. It ain't just your body that betrays you, it's the way the world starts to see you. One day you're Otis Harlan, respected mechanic, businessman, pillar of the community. Next day you're just an old man who needs help, who can't be trusted with his own decisions, who should be grateful anyone's looking after him at all. But what really got me, what really showed me how deep this thing went, was when I overheard them talking one evening. I'd gone to bed early, least that's what they thought, but I'd come back down for a glass of water. My Eleanor always said I walked quiet as a cat, and that night that served me well. They were in the kitchen, Clyde and Loretta, and they were discussing me like I was a problem to be solved. "We need to move faster," Loretta was saying. "He's still too sharp, still asking too many questions, and Clyde, my boy, my only child," he said, "give it time. A few more months and we can suggest Pine Grove, the nursing home out on Route 47, the one that smells like disinfectant and despair, where old folks go to be forgotten." I stood there in my own hallway, in the dark, listening to my son plan my disposal, and you know what hurt the most? He sounded so casual about it, like he was discussing what to do with an old car that won't run anymore. No emotion, no conflict, just cold calculation. That's when I remembered something from years back when Clyde was maybe 12. We'd gone fishing out at Table Rock Lake, just the two of us, and he'd caught this little sunfish. Wasn't good for eating, too small, and I told him to throw it back. But he wanted to keep it, wanted to watch it die in the bucket. "I just want to see what happens," he'd said. I made him throw it back, told him we don't kill for curiosity's sake. But the way he looked at that fish, fascinated by its gasping ... I should have paid more attention to that. The next morning, I started being more careful, started watching them the way they were watching me. I saw how Loretta went through my mail before bringing it to me, how Clyde had put some kind of app on my phone that let him track where I went. They'd smile and bring me coffee, ask about my day, but their eyes were always calculating, always measuring how much fight I had left in me. I started hiding things then. Important papers, bank statements, anything that showed what I really had beyond that house. See, they thought they knew everything about old Otis, thought they had my whole life figured out. But there's something about spending 50 years buying up forgotten parcels of land, watching a town grow up around them, that teaches you the value of keeping your cards close to your chest. My daddy once told me, back when I was young and thought I knew everything, "Son, the moment folks think they got you figured out is the moment you got the advantage." I didn't understand it then, but standing in that house that wasn't feeling like mine anymore, watching my son and his wife circle me like vultures, I finally got what he meant. They wanted me to be the confused old man, the burden, the problem to be solved. So I started giving them what they wanted to see. I'd forget little things, ask the same question twice, move a little slower when they were watching. All the while, I was sharp as a tack, planning my next move, protecting what was really mine. But late at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone in the bed I'd shared with Eleanor for 43 years, I'd lie awake wondering how it came to this. How does a man's own blood turn against him? How does the boy you raised, whose scraped knees you bandaged, whose tears you dried, whose dreams you supported, how does he become your enemy? Eleanor used to say people show you who they are if you just pay attention. Said it about the folks who came to the shop, about neighbors, about everyone except our own boy. Maybe she couldn't see it in him, or maybe she could and just couldn't bear to say it out loud. But lying there in the dark, I could hear her voice clear as day. "Watch out for yourself, Otis. Promise me you'll watch out for yourself." I was watching now. I was watching real good, and what I saw was that I was running out of time. They were closing in, getting bolder, caring less about keeping up appearances. That house I built with my own two hands, filled with love and memories and Eleanor's spirit, it was becoming my prison. And my guards, they were the two people who should have loved me most. But they didn't know about the ace up my sleeve. They didn't know about the papers hidden in a safety deposit box 3 towns over, or the lawyer in Kansas City who'd been handling my real business for 30 years. They thought they were playing chess with a senile old fool. They had no idea they were playing against a man who'd been 3 steps ahead of everybody else since before they were born. Still, knowing you got ammunition and using it are 2 different things. Because once I played that card, there'd be no going back. Once I showed them what Otis Harlan really had, what he'd really built all these years, everything would change. And maybe I'm a foolish old man, but part of me still hoped I wouldn't have to. Part of me still hoped my boy would remember who he used to be, would stop this thing before it went too far. But hope, I was learning, is sometimes just another word for delay. And delay, when you're 82 and fighting for your dignity, is a luxury you can't afford. They were digging up Eleanor's roses, erasing our life together, planning my removal like I was just another obstacle in their path to whatever it was they thought they wanted. That night, after I heard them discussing Pine Grove, I made myself a promise. I might be old, might have hands that shake and eyes that need glasses, but I was still Otis Harlan. I'd built a life, built a fortune they couldn't even imagine, and I'd be damned if I'd let them bury me before my time. Eleanor's roses might be gone, but I was still here. And I was about to show them that sometimes the biggest surprises come in the oldest packages. The silence in that house started weighing on me like a stone on my chest. Not the quiet kind of silence you get in the evening when everyone's settled in, but the heavy kind, the kind that comes when people stop seeing you as a person worth talking to. I'd walk into a room and conversation would stop, like I was a child who wasn't supposed to hear adult matters. In my own house, built with these hands, I'd become a ghost who hadn't had the sense to die yet. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, same spot where I'd had my coffee for 40-some years, and Loretta was on the phone with someone, talking about renovations. She was going through plans like I wasn't even there, discussing tearing down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, the wall where Eleanor had hung all our family photos. When she finished her call, she looked at me like she was surprised to find me there in my own kitchen, drinking from my own cup. That's when it really hit me how they'd been chipping away at my life, making me smaller and smaller in my own space. They'd moved my chair from the living room, said it didn't match the new decor. They'd packed away my tools from the garage, claimed they were worried I'd hurt myself. Piece by piece, they were erasing Otis Harlan, making room for whoever they thought should live in his place. But here's something about being invisible, something they didn't count on. When people stop seeing you, they also stop being careful around you. They leave papers out, have conversations they think you won't understand, make plans they assume you won't remember. And me, I might have been playing the part of the confused old man, but my mind was sharp as the day I opened my first shop. Late one night, couldn't sleep again, I found myself in the basement, going through boxes they hadn't gotten to yet. Down there in the musty dark, with the furnace humming and the house creaking above me, I found my old ledgers from the shop. Pages and pages of neat figures, every transaction recorded in my careful hand. But tucked between those pages were other receipts, other records. Land purchases going back to 1972, parcels bought for next to nothing in places nobody wanted to be. There was the lot out by the old railroad tracks bought for $800 when everyone said I was crazy. That's where the shopping center sits now. The acres near Miller's Pond, swampland they called it, until the city drained it and put in the business district. Plot after plot, year after year, I'd been buying up the forgotten corners of this town, seeing what others couldn't see, planning for a future that was now the present. Eleanor knew about some of my investments, but not the full extent. It wasn't out of distrust, we shared everything that mattered. But my daddy lived through the Depression, taught me to never let your left hand know what your right hand's doing when it comes to money, even with those you love most. It was a habit born of caution, not secrecy. I'd mention buying a lot here and there, and she'd nod and trust my judgment, never knowing it was part of something much bigger. The funny thing is, I never cared much about being rich. Each purchase was just security, just making sure Eleanor and I would never want for nothing, making sure Clyde would have something solid when we were gone. I lived the same life, drove the same trucks, wore the same clothes. The money wasn't for spending, it was for peace of mind. But now, sitting in that basement with those old papers, I realized I'd built myself more than security, I'd built myself options. I heard footsteps above me, Loretta's heels clicking on the hardwood, and I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Let them think old Otis was down here confused, maybe looking for Christmas decorations in July. I even knocked over a box of Eleanor's canning jars on purpose, made some noise, acted flustered when Clyde came down to check on me. The next few weeks, I watched them closer, saw things I'd been missing. They'd been going through the house methodical-like, checking every drawer, every closet, every corner. Looking for what? I wondered, did they suspect there was more than just the house? Or were they just making sure they knew everything the old man had? I started taking walks then, long walks they didn't like me taking. Said they were worried I'd get lost, but really they were worried about where I might go, who I might talk to. But an old man taking his constitutional, stopping to rest on benches, feeding birds in the park, nothing suspicious about that. Nobody needed to know that one of those benches was right outside the office of Abram Harrison, attorney at law, who'd been handling my affairs since 1987. The weight of secrets is a funny thing. When you're young, they feel exciting, like power you hold. When you're old, they feel like burdens you carry. But sometimes, I was learning, they're the only weapons you got left. And I had a lifetime of them, each one documented, notarized, and locked away where grabbing hands couldn't reach. One evening, I was sitting on the porch, the one Eleanor and I used to sit on every evening after dinner, and I overheard Clyde on the phone through the open window. He was talking to someone about power of attorney, about competency evaluations, about how to expedite things. His voice was different when he thought I couldn't hear. Harder, calculating, like a stranger's voice coming from my son's throat. That's when I knew for certain that the boy I'd raised was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all. Maybe I'd just seen what I wanted to see, painted over his sharp edges with a father's hope. Maybe Eleanor had seen it clearer. Maybe that's why she made me promise to watch out for myself. Not from strangers or the world outside, but from the danger that was closest to home. The humiliation of it all was maybe the worst part. Having to pretend I didn't understand when they talked slow and loud at me. Having to act grateful when they'd remind me to take pills I'd never forgotten. Having to bite my tongue when Loretta threw out Eleanor's things, claiming they were cluttering up the space. Each small indignity piled on the last, designed to make me feel worthless, designed to make me believe I needed them to manage my life. But every night, after they'd gone to bed in the guest room they'd turned into their master's suite, I'd lie awake planning. Not revenge, exactly. I'm too old and too tired for revenge. Just justice, just a setting right of things that had gone so wrong. They thought they were wearing me down, thought they were days or weeks away from shipping me off to Pine Grove, from taking everything I'd built. They had no idea that Otis Harlan had been playing the long game since before they were born. They had no idea that every document they needed, every piece of paper that would give them what they wanted, had a twin locked away in places they'd never think to look. They had no idea that the confused old man they saw doddering around the house had more fight left in him than they could imagine. The silence in that house was heavy, yes. But I was learning to use it, to move through it like a fish through water. They'd made me invisible in my own home, turned me into a ghost before my time. But ghosts, I was discovering, can go places and see things that the living miss. And this ghost was about to show them that sometimes the dead have more power than the living ever suspect. That night, as I listened to the house settle around me, to the bones of the home I'd built creaking in the wind, I made my decision. Come morning, I'd make my move. I'd stop playing defense and start playing offense. They wanted the house. They could have it, but they were about to learn that the house was just the beginning, just the tip of an iceberg they never saw coming. Eleanor's roses might be gone from the garden, but their roots ran deep, deeper than anyone knew. And sometimes the things that look dead on the surface are just waiting for the right moment to bloom again. They'd forgotten that before I was an old man, before I was their problem to solve, I was Otis Harlan. And Otis Harlan had one more surprise left in him. That morning came different than the others. The sun hit my window the same way it had for decades, that soft Missouri light that Eleanor used to say was like honey pouring over everything. But inside me, something had shifted in the night. I lay there in bed, feeling my bones creak and settle, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel old. I felt like a man with purpose again. Getting dressed, I took my time. Put on my good flannel, the blue one Eleanor bought me for Christmas years back. Combed what's left of my hair neat and proper. Even splashed on some of that aftershave Clyde gave me for Father's Day, back when he still remembered such things. Looking in the mirror, I saw Otis Harlan looking back, not the shadow they'd been trying to make me believe I was. Downstairs, Loretta was already rearranging things. She'd moved the coffee pot again, put it in some full place where I had to reach over the stove to get to it, deliberate like everything else. Making me look clumsy, making me seem like I couldn't manage simple tasks. But this morning, I didn't let it bother me. I reached for that pot steady as you please, poured my coffee without spilling a drop. The newspaper was there on the table, but I noticed they'd started hiding the business section, thought I wouldn't notice, I suppose. Thought old Otis didn't need to know about property values and development plans and zoning change. But I'd been reading about every single one of those things since before they were born. Every shopping center going up, every new subdivision, every change in the commercial district, I knew about it. More than knew about it, in most cases. I took my coffee out to the porch, sat in the rocker they hadn't managed to throw away yet. From there, I could see the whole neighborhood waking up. The Gables next door, young couple with twin boys. The Morrisons across the street, been there almost as long as us. Normal people living normal lives, no idea of the war being waged in the house with the wraparound porch and the missing rose garden. But wars, I learned in Vietnam, aren't always won with the biggest gun. Sometimes they're won by the man who knows the terrain best, who's willing to wait for just the right moment, and I knew this terrain better than anyone. Not just the neighborhood, not just the town, but the invisible landscape of deeds and titles and property lines that really mattered. Round about 9, I heard Clyde stirring upstairs. He'd been sleeping later and later, living in my house rent-free while planning my eviction. The irony of it might have been funny if it wasn't my life. When he finally came down, he had that look on his face, the one that said he was fixing to have another one of those talks with me. About my health, about my safety, about how worried they were, but this morning I spoke first. Told him I was thinking about taking a drive, maybe heading out to look at the old shop. The way his face changed, quick as lightning from fake concern to real alarm, told me everything. They didn't want me going nowhere alone, didn't want me talking to nobody without supervision. But what could he say? Can't tell a man he's too senile to drive when you need him competent enough to sign papers. He offered to come with me, of course, for safety, he said. But I just smiled, told him I'd be fine, that a man needs his independence. Used their own words against them, the ones about dignity and keeping active. Watched him struggle with it, wanting to forbid me, but not having the grounds yet. Not until they got them papers signed, not until some doctor they'd paid said I wasn't fit to make my own choices. I drove slow through town, taking it all in, past the Walmart sitting on what used to be the Henley farm, my land now leased for more than most folks make in a year. Past the medical complex on what was once swampland everyone said was worthless, my land, too, bought for the price of a used car. Past the new subdivision going up on the old Patterson place, bought that at tax auction in '89, held it till the time was right. The shop was still there, closed up now but solid. I'd sold the business years back but kept the building. Another thing Clyde didn't know. The new owner paid rent, had for a decade, money going into an account Clyde had never heard of. Standing there in the parking lot, I could almost hear the ring of wrenches on concrete, smell the oil and metal, feel the satisfaction of honest work. But that life was gone now, and I had to focus on the one I was living. The one where my son was trying to erase me, where my daughter-in-law was dismantling my life piece by piece, where I had to fight for the right to exist in my own story. It wasn't the retirement I'd pictured, wasn't the golden years Eleanor and I had planned. But it was what I had, and I'd be damned if I'd go down without using every tool in my box. On the way back, I stopped at the park, the one where Clyde used to play Little League. Sat on a bench, fed some pigeons, looked like any other old man killing time. But I was watching, always watching, saw two men in suits walking the perimeter, taking pictures, making notes. Developers, by the look of them, measuring, planning, seeing possibility. They had no idea they were standing on Otis Harlan's land, bought when this was nothing but a drainage ditch and a hobo camp. That's when it really hit me, the full weight of what I'd built without even meaning to. All them little purchases, all them patient years of holding and waiting, they'd added up to something massive. Something Clyde and Loretta couldn't even imagine. They thought they were stealing a house and whatever savings an old mechanic might have tucked away. They were trying to rob a man who owned half the commercial district without a soul knowing it. The question was, did I want them to know? Part of me, the hurt part, the betrayed father part, wanted to see their faces when they learned the truth. Wanted to watch them realize what they'd thrown away for a house and some suspected saving. But another part, the practical part that had kept secrets for 50 years, knew that knowledge was power only as long as it stayed secret. Driving back to the house, I made my decision. I wouldn't show my hand, not yet, but I would start protecting what was mine in ways they couldn't see or stop. Legal ways, quiet ways, the same patient ways I'd built it all in the first place. Let them think they were winning while I moved the real treasures out of their reach. When I got home, they were both waiting, trying not to look like they'd been worried, trying not to look like they'd been going through my things while I was gone. I played my part, seemed a little confused about where I'd been, a little tired from the drive. Watched them exchange them looks, the ones that said the old fool was getting worse, that it wouldn't be long now. That night at dinner, sitting at the table where my family used to laugh and share their days, where Eleanor served thousands of meals made with love, I looked at these two strangers wearing familiar faces. They chatted about their plans, their dreams, their future in this house. My house, Eleanor's house, the house that was now just a prison with familiar walls. But prisons, I remembered from Vietnam, could be escaped. Sometimes by force, sometimes by cunning, sometimes by simply outlasting your captors. And I had something they didn't, the patience of a man who'd spent 50 years playing a game they didn't even know existed. Tomorrow, I'd make my first real move. Tonight, I'd let them think they'd won. The coffee pot was still in that full place when I went to bed, but I didn't care anymore. Let them move things around, let them play their petty games. I had bigger fish to fry, as my daddy used to say, and tomorrow the frying would begin. Strange things started happening after my drive to the old shop. Clyde and Loretta got sweeter than pecan pie, falling all over themselves to be helpful. Breakfast appeared on the table before I even came downstairs. Fresh flowers showed up in a vase, store-bought, nothing like Eleanor's roses, but an effort all the same. They started including me in conversations, asking my opinion on things they'd already decided. The change was so sudden it might have given me whiplash if I hadn't been expecting something. See, while I was out on my drive, they'd done more than worrying. I could tell by the way things in my room had been moved just a hair, the picture frame angled different, the drawer not quite closed the same way. They'd been searching again, and this time I had a pretty good idea they'd found something. In the back of my closet, behind shoes I never wore anymore, I'd kept an old shoe box. Nothing special about it, just receipts and papers from over the years. But mixed in with old tax returns and warranty cards were a few property deeds, not the important ones, mind you, just some of the smaller lots. Enough to make them realize there was more to old Otis than they'd figured, not enough to show the whole picture. That evening, Loretta made pot roast, used to be Eleanor's recipe, though it didn't taste nothing like hers. Too much salt, not enough time in the oven, but I ate it and complimented her, playing along with whatever game they'd decided on. Clyde kept filling my water glass, asking if I needed anything, treating me like a guest of honor instead of an unwanted boarder. After dinner, Clyde suggested we sit on the porch, just like old times. The sun was setting, painting the sky colors that reminded me of Eleanor's favorite scarf. We sat there, him trying to make small talk, me wondering when he'd get to what he really wanted to say. The waiting was almost comical, watching him work up his nerve while pretending everything was normal. Finally, he cleared his throat, that same sound he used to make as a boy when he had to confess to breaking something. Started talking about family legacy, about preserving what I'd built, about making sure everything was properly organized for the future, dancing around what he really wanted to know. How much more was there? What else had his old fool father been hiding? I let him fish for a while, giving him just enough rope. Mentioned casually how I'd made some investments over the years, nothing fancy, just a working man's saving. Watched his eyes light up like Christmas morning, though he tried to hide it. The greed was so naked, so hungry, it almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. Then Loretta joined us, carrying coffee and wearing a smile that would have fooled anybody who hadn't seen her real face. She started talking about financial planning, about how important it was to have everything documented, about how they just wanted to help me get organized. The two of them tag-teaming me like I was too stupid to see what they were doing. That's when I made my first deliberate mistake. Mentioned something about papers in a safety deposit box, then acted like I'd forgotten what I was saying. Watched them exchange glances, saw the wheels turning. A safety deposit box meant more secrets, more hidden assets. The pot roast and fake kindness were about to get a lot thicker. Over the next few days, they nearly killed me with consideration. Clyde offered to drive me to the bank, help me sort through any papers that might be confusing. Loretta suggested we make a list of all my assets just so nothing got forgotten. They were like vultures who'd learned to smile, circling what they thought was a dying animal with a hidden cache. But here's the thing about safety deposit boxes, you can have more than one. The one at First National, the one they'd escort me to, that had some bonds, some old coins Eleanor collected, few property deeds for lots worth maybe $50,000 all told. Enough to make them salivate, not enough to satisfy. The real boxes, the ones at banks in neighboring counties, the ones registered under the business names they didn't know I had, those were different story. One morning, I woke to find them in the kitchen with a stranger, lawyer, by the look of him. Cheap suit, eager smile, the kind who chased ambulances and promised big settlements. They introduced him as a family friend who specialized in estate planning. Just happened to drop by, they said, just happened to have papers with him. I played confused, asked what estate planning meant, watched them explain it like I was a child. The lawyer laid out documents, started talking about living trusts and power of attorney and medical directives. All perfectly reasonable, he assured me, all designed to protect my interests. The lies dripped off his tongue smooth as motor oil. That's when I pulled out my reading glasses, the ones I rarely used, in front of them. Started reading every line, asking questions that made the lawyer shift in his seat. Nothing too sharp, just enough to make him realize this wasn't going to be as easy as they'd promised him. Asked for time to think it over, maybe have my own lawyer look at it. The disappointment on their faces was worth the price of admission, but the real revelation came that night. I'd gone to bed early, left them downstairs to discuss their failed attempt. Heard Clyde on the phone with someone, voice tight with frustration. From what I could make out, they owed money. A lot of it. Loretta's failed business ventures, Clyde's gambling debts he thought I didn't know about. They weren't just greedy. They were desperate. That changed everything. Desperate people make mistakes, take risks, show their true colors. They'd been playing a long game, but now they needed to speed things up. The fake kindness would only last so long before they tried something more direct. And suddenly, I wasn't just fighting for my dignity or my home. I was fighting against whatever cornered animals might do when they got desperate enough. I lay there in the dark, in the bed where Eleanor and I had dreamed our dreams and made our plans, and I knew the time for patience was running short. They'd shown their hand, lawyers, forged documents probably, pressure tactics disguised as care. Now I had to show mine, at least part of it. Had to let them know that Otis Harlan wasn't some paper tiger they could crumple up and throw away. The next morning, I made a call from the old rotary phone in the basement, the one they didn't know still worked. Called Abram Harrison, my real lawyer, the one who'd helped me build my invisible empire. Told him it was time to start moving things, protecting things, making sure grabbing hands couldn't reach what mattered. He'd been waiting for this call, he said, been expecting it since Eleanor passed. When I came back upstairs, they were waiting with more papers, more smiles, more promises of how much better everything would be once I just signed on the dotted line. I smiled back, told them I'd found my own lawyer, that he'd be in touch. Watched their faces freeze, watched the mask slip for just a second before they caught themselves. The war was entering a new phase now. They discovered I had secrets, but not how many. They'd shown their desperation, but not their limits. And me, I'd shown them I still had fight, but not how much. The house felt different that morning, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone pretending things were fine while lightning gathered on the horizon. Loretta dropped a coffee cup that afternoon, shattered it on Eleanor's kitchen floor. She cursed, sharp and ugly, before remembering I was there. But I'd heard the real her in that curse, the frustration and rage barely contained. Clyde's hands shook when he helped clean it up. The pressure was getting to them, the possibility that their sure thing might not be so sure after all. Good, I thought, sweeping up the last of the porcelain shards, let them sweat, let them wonder. Let them realize that the old man they'd written off might have one more round left in him. The coffee cup wasn't the only thing about to shatter in this house. And unlike porcelain, some things can't be swept up and thrown away. The morning I couldn't get into my own house changed everything. I'd gone to the market early, like I always did on Tuesdays, picking up bread from the bakery, some of them tomatoes Eleanor used to love. Sun was shining, birds were singing, felt almost like a normal day. But when I got home and put my key in the lock, it wouldn't turn. Not stuck, not jammed. The lock had been changed. I stood there on my own porch, grocery bag in my hand, staring at that lock like it might explain itself. Then I saw Loretta's face in the window, watching me with a smile cold enough to freeze July. She took her time coming to the door. made me wait like a salesman or a beggar. When she finally opened it, she didn't move aside to let me in. The words came out of her mouth sweet as poison. The house wasn't safe for me anymore, she said. They'd had to change the locks after I'd wandered off confused the other day. Didn't I remember? They were just protecting me. From now on, I'd need to be supervised for my own good. And maybe it would be better if I didn't go out alone anymore. I was a prisoner. In the house I built, on the land I cleared, under the roof I shingled with these two hands, I was a prisoner, and the worst part. When I tried to push past her, Clyde appeared behind her, blocking the doorway of his childhood home like a bouncer at a bar. My own son, the boy I taught to ride a bike in that very driveway, standing against me. The neighbors were watching, Mrs. Gable from next door, pretending to water her plants. The Morrison kids across the street, pausing their basketball game to stare. And what did they see? An old man being difficult. An elderly father being cared for by his concerned family. Because that's how Clyde and Loretta had been painting it for months, dropping hints about my confusion, my wandering, my declining health. They let me in eventually, but the message was clear. This wasn't my home anymore. I was allowed to exist in it, but only on their terms. My keys were taken away, for safety. My phone was moved to the kitchen where they could monitor calls, for my protection. My bedroom door, which had never had a lock, suddenly sprouted one. From the outside, that night I heard them talking to someone on the porch. Couldn't make out all the words, but I heard Pine Grove mentioned again, heard something about expediting paperwork. They were moving fast now, faster than before. Whatever debts they had, whatever pressure they were under, it was pushing them to take bigger risks. The next few days were the longest of my life. They had me sign papers, told me they were grocery lists, permission slips for home repairs. I played along, scribbling nonsense, making my signature shaky and wrong. Let them forge what they wanted. Abram had samples of my real signature, recent ones, video of me signing documents. Every fake paper they created was just more rope for their own news. But knowing that didn't make living it easier. Being trapped in your own home, treated like a child or worse, it wears on a man. Eleanor's pictures started disappearing from the walls, replaced with generic prints from some store. My chair was moved to face the corner like I was being punished. Meals appeared on a tray, eaten alone while they dined together in the dining room. I was no longer welcome in. The isolation was the worst part. They intercepted mail, screened calls, turned away visitors, told everyone I was too unwell for company, that I needed rest. Mrs. Gable tried to bring cookies one afternoon, saw me through the window. I waved, tried to help, but Loretta appeared and hustled her away with lies about contagious conditions and doctor's orders. That's when I realized they weren't just trying to steal from me. They were trying to erase me, make me disappear while I was still breathing, turn me into a ghost haunting my own life. And if the neighbors believed I was losing my mind, who would question it when I finally vanished into Pine Grove? Who would investigate when Clyde sadly sold the family home to cover medical expenses, but they'd made one mistake. In their rush to cut me off from the world, they'd forgotten about the basement phone. That old rotary, installed in 1978 when Eleanor worried about tornadoes, still worked, still had its own line they didn't know about. Late at night, when they thought I was sleeping, I'd creep down those stairs and make my calls. Abram was moving money, securing properties, building legal walls they couldn't breach. My friend George from the shop was asking questions around town, finding out just how deep Clyde's debts went. The pieces were moving on a board Clyde and Loretta couldn't see, protecting what needed protecting, gathering evidence of what they were doing. One evening, I overheard Loretta on the phone with that cheap lawyer. They were discussing something called an emergency guardianship, talking about judges who might be sympathetic, doctors who could be persuaded. The words floated up through the floorboards like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything. That's when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. They were maybe days away from having legal control, from being able to ship me off and take everything. The careful plan Abram and I had built would take too long. I needed to force their hand, make them show their true colors in a way that couldn't be hidden or explained away. So I started refused to eat, refused to take the pills they claimed were mine, refused to sign anything, became the difficult old man they'd been telling everyone I was. And just like I'd hoped, they got frustrated, got sloppy. The sweet masks slipped more often, showing the ugly underneath. Clyde grabbed my arm one morning, hard enough to leave bruises. Shook me when I wouldn't sign something, called me names I won't repeat. Loretta threw a plate when I knocked over the pills, screamed about ungrateful old fools who didn't know when to die. All of it in front of the window, where Mrs. Gable's security camera could see where the Morrisons' teenage daughter was recording everything on her phone. They didn't know about the cameras, didn't know that Mrs. Gable's son had installed them after a break-in down the street. Didn't know that the Morrison girl had been documenting what she called elder abuse for a school project on social justice. Didn't know that their performance was being watched by more than just their victim. The bruises on my arm turned purple, then green, then yellow. I made sure to wear short sleeves, made sure people could see when I sat on the porch during the brief moments they let me outside. Started writing notes on napkins, dropping them where neighbors might find them. Help, prisoner, call police. Simple words that said everything. One night, they forgot to lock my bedroom door. Or maybe I'd finally worn them down with my resistance. I crept out, made it to the kitchen, managed to call 911 before they caught me. Told the dispatcher I was being held against my will, that I feared for my safety. Clyde grabbed the phone, told them his father was confused, suffering from dementia. But the seed was planted. There was a record now. They let me in after that, took away even the pretense of freedom, but it was too late. The neighbors were talking, the cameras were recording, the police had a report. The perfect crime they'd planned was unraveling, and they were too desperate to see it. They thought they were close to winning, thought a few more days would give them everything. They had no idea that Abram was filing papers of his own, that George was gathering affidavits from concerned neighbors, that the elder abuse investigator was already building a case, that the fortune they thought they were stealing had already been moved beyond their reach. They were fighting for crumbs while the real feast was locked away where their greedy hands would never touch it. The house felt like a tomb those last days, 3 people who should have been family, circling each other like wary animals. Them watching me for signs of surrender, me watching them for the final mistake that would bring it all crashing down. Eleanor's house had become a battlefield, and only one side could win. But I had something they didn't, the patience of a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They'd taken my freedom, my dignity, my peace. They'd tried to take my mind, my will, my very existence. But they couldn't take what they couldn't find, and they couldn't find what I'd spent 50 years hiding. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered. The lawyers were ready. All that was left was to spring it, to watch their house of cards collapse and take them with it. They thought they'd won by locking me in. They had no idea they'd locked themselves in with me. And unlike them, I knew exactly how this was going to end. That morning, I woke up different, not confused, not defeated, but clear as spring water. The bruises on my arm had faded to yellow, but my resolve had hardened to steel. I'd spent too many days being their victim, too many nights lying awake feeling sorry for myself. Eleanor didn't raise no quitter, and Otis Harlan had one more fight left in him. I got dressed careful and proper, putting on my good shirt, the one they'd hidden in the back of the closet. Combed my hair neat, even managed to shave with the electric razor they'd left me, probably figured I was too feeble to hurt myself with it. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a beaten old man anymore. I saw someone who'd survived Vietnam, built a business, raised a family, and by God would survive this too. The house was quiet when I tested my door, locked, as always, but locks are funny thing. They only work if the person on the other side wants to stay put. And I'd spent enough years working with my hands to know that every lock has a weakness, every door has a give. The bedroom door in the house I built, I knew every squeak, every loose board, every place where the wood had settled over the years. It took patience, but patience was something I had plenty of. Working that lock with an old credit card, the one they'd missed when they went through my wallet. Feeling for the catch, remembering how I'd installed these doors myself, back when Clyde was small and we worried about him wandering at night. Ironic, using the same door meant to keep a child safe to escape from that same child 40 years later. When the lock finally gave, I stood there for a moment, listening. They were downstairs, arguing about something. Money sounded like. Always money with those two. I moved quiet as smoke down the hallway, past the pictures they'd replaced, past the empty spaces where a life used to hang. Made it to the spare room, the one Eleanor used for sewing, where the phone extension still sat on her old desk. My hands shook as I dialed, but not from age or fear, from pure, clean anger. The kind that burns away everything else and leaves just purpose. Abram answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. Told him it was time, that I couldn't wait any longer, that they'd crossed every line there was to cross. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the satisfaction in it. He'd been waiting for this call too. Next call was to George. Told him to contact that elder abuse investigator, tell her everything he'd gathered. The recordings, the testimonies, the evidence of imprisonment and theft. Then I called someone else, someone Clyde and Loretta had never heard of, Marcus Webb, the developer who'd been trying to buy one of my properties for 3 years. Told him I was ready to talk, but it had to be today, had to be now. I could hear them coming up the stairs as I hung up. Managed to get back to my room, credit card tucked away, sitting in my chair like I'd never moved. When they unlocked the door, I was just an old man staring out the window, harmless as a sleeping cat. But inside, the wheels were turning. The machine I'd set in motion couldn't be stopped now. Loretta brought my breakfast tray, same slop they'd been serving lately. Oatmeal like paste, coffee like dishwater. Set it down hard enough to spill, didn't even pretend to care anymore. But I smiled at her, thanked her sweet as pie. Watched confusion flicker across her face. They were used to my resistance now, my stubborn refusal. Compliance made them nervous. Around 10, I heard cars pulling up outside, multiple cars. Clyde's face appeared at my door, pale and sweating. Something about inspectors, about reports, about misunderstanding. He needed me to talk to them, needed me to tell them everything was fine. The desperation in his voice was music to my ears. I told him I was too confused, too tired. Watched him realize he'd played his hand too well. How could a man too senile to care for himself convince authorities he was fine? The voices downstairs got louder, official voices asking hard questions. I heard Loretta's shrill denials, Clyde's stammering explanations. Then footsteps on the stairs, heavy and purposeful. A knock on my door, from the outside, polite but firm. When it opened, there stood a woman in a suit, badge visible, eyes that missed nothing. Behind her, uniformed officers. She introduced herself, asked if I was being held against my will. Asked about the locks, the bruises, the reports from concerned neighbors. I didn't have to lie, didn't have to exaggerate, just told the truth, simple and plain. Yes, they'd locked me in. Yes, they'd taken my keys. Yes, I feared for my safety. Yes, I wanted out. The next star was controlled chaos. Clyde and Loretta being questioned separately. Me being examined by a paramedic, bruises documented, statements taken. Locks being photographed, windows being checked. The cheap lawyer showing up and being turned away. Mrs. Gable coming over, tears in her eyes, showing the officers her camera footage. The Morrison girl, brave as anything, sharing her recording. But the real circus started when Abram arrived. Not alone, but with a whole team, real lawyers, not the strip mall variety. Documents in hand, court orders already filed. Injunctions against Clyde and Loretta freezing any assets they thought they'd gained. Criminal charges for elder abuse, false imprisonment, attempted fraud. The list went on and on. Watching their faces as they realized what was happening, that was worth every minute of suffering. The house they'd stolen wasn't theirs, never had been, thanks to the trust Eleanor and I set up decades ago. The papers they'd had me sign were worthless. Video evidence showed coercion and diminished capacity. The money they'd hoped to steal had vanished like morning mist, moved to places they'd never find. But I wasn't done. While they sat in my kitchen being read their rights, Marcus Webb arrived. Big man, bigger smile, biggest check I'd ever seen. Right there, in front of God and everybody, we completed the sale of the Morrison Street property. $2.3 million for a lot Clyde didn't even know I owned. Made sure he could see the numbers. Made sure he understood exactly what his greed had cost him, the best part. I announced right there, voice clear as a bell, that every penny would be donated to the Pine Grove Nursing Home, not for my care. I wouldn't be needing their services, but to build a new wing for residents who'd been abandoned by their families. The Otis and Eleanor Harlan Memorial Wing, where forgotten folks could live with dignity. Clyde's face went from pale to green to something beyond color. Loretta started screaming, had to be restrained. All their debts, all their schemes, all their desperate dreams of easy money, crumbling like old newspaper. They destroyed our family for nothing. Sold their souls for a prize that was never theirs to take. As they were led away in handcuffs, Clyde looked back at me. For just a second, I saw something in his eyes, not the stranger he'd become, but the ghost of the boy he'd been. The boy who'd helped in the garage, who'd loved his mother, who'd once upon a time loved me. But it was too late for ghosts, too late for what-ifs and might-have-beens. The house got quiet after they left, just me and Abram and the echoes of everything that had happened. He asked if I wanted to stay, said the house was mine again, would always be mine. But looking around, all I could see were the empty spaces where love used to live. Eleanor's roses were gone, her pictures were packed away. The boy we'd raised here had turned into someone I didn't recognize. The house might be mine, but it wasn't home anymore. I made one more call that day, to a realtor I knew, told her to list it. Every penny from the sale would go to charity, just like the land. Let some new family fill these rooms with laughter, plant new roses in the garden, make new memories on the porch. The house had seen enough sorrow, time to let it shelter joy again. That night, I slept at Mrs. Gable's house. She wouldn't hear of me staying alone, not after everything. Made up the guest room nice, cooked a dinner that tasted like food again. We sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, not talking much but not needing to. Sometimes just being seen, being valued, being free is enough. The war was over. I'd won, if you could call it winning when victory tasted like ashes. But I was free. Free to live what years I had left on my own terms. Free to honor Eleanor's memory properly. Free to be Otis Harlan again, not someone's problem or someone's meal ticket. Just a man who'd fought his last fight and somehow, against all odds, came out standing. The courtroom was packed that Thursday morning. Word had gotten out about the old man who'd outsmarted his greedy kin, and folks wanted to see how it played out. I sat there in my best suit, the one Eleanor made me buy for our 40th anniversary, feeling every one of my 82 years but sitting straight as a pine tree. Across the aisle, Clyde and Loretta looked smaller than I'd ever seen them, their lawyer whispering furious instructions they weren't hearing. The judge, a woman about my daughter-in-law's age but with kind eyes, had already reviewed the evidence. The forged documents, the false imprisonment. The elder abuse caught on camera, the attempted theft of property through coercion. Each charge read out loud made Clyde sink lower in his chair, made Loretta's jaw clench tighter. But we hadn't even gotten to the real show yet. When Abram stood to present our case, he didn't just bring papers, he brought a story. The story of Otis Harlan, who'd worked his hands raw building a business, raising a family, investing every spare penny in the future of his town. He showed maps of all the properties, photographs of what they'd been and what they'd become. The abandoned lots turned shopping centers, the swampland turned medical complexes. The forgotten corners turned into thriving neighborhoods. The gasps from the gallery when he revealed the full extent of my holdings were worth the price of admission. 23 properties, commercial leases generating 6 figures annually. Land holdings valued at over $14 million. Not bad for a grease monkey from Missouri who started with nothing but strong hands and a patient heart. Clyde's lawyer dropped his pen. It rolled across the floor and nobody moved to pick it up, but Abram wasn't done. He presented the trust documents, signed and notarized years before Clyde ever thought to steal from me. Every property protected, every asset shielded, everything arranged so that even if they'd succeeded in their scheme, they'd have gotten nothing but the house. Eleanor and I had planned for everything, including the possibility that our own blood might turn against us. Then came the witnesses, Mrs. Gable, dignified in her Sunday best, describing the locks, the isolation, the fear in my eyes when I'd wave from the window. The Morrison girl, brave as a lion, playing her recordings of Clyde grabbing me, Loretta screaming about ungrateful old fools. George from the shop, telling about suspicious bruises, strange stories, worried customers asking why Otis Harlan was being kept prisoner. The prosecutor presented the emergency guardianship papers they'd tried to file, full of lies about my mental state. Then played a video Abram had made just days before, showing me sharp as ever, discussing complex financial matters, remembering dates and figures and details they'd claimed I couldn't grasp. The contrast was damning. They'd painted me as senile to steal from me, but the evidence showed a man in full possession of his faculties, fighting for his freedom. When it came time for Clyde to testify, he could barely speak above a whisper, tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd only wanted to help, that the debts had made him desperate. The gambling debts, turned out, were worse than I'd known. $600,000 to some very unforgiving people. Loretta's failed businesses had burned through their savings, their credit, their friends' patience. They'd seen me as their lottery ticket, their salvation from consequences they'd earned. Loretta took the stand like she was walking to her execution. The prosecutor asked her about the roses, of all things. Why had she destroyed Eleanor Harlan's prize-winning rose garden? Loretta's face twisted, and for the first time, the real woman showed through. Jealousy, she spat. Tired of hearing about perfect Eleanor, sainted Eleanor, Eleanor who could do no wrong. Tired of living in a dead woman's shadow, in a house that felt like a shrine. That's when I understood it all, finally. It wasn't just about money, it was about erasure. They wanted to wipe out Eleanor and me, our life together, our memories, our very existence. Replace it all with their own story, their own future built on the bones of our past. The money was just part of it. They wanted to delete us like we were just rough drafts of the life they thought they deserved. The judge called a recess and I stepped outside for air. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, neighbors, strangers who'd heard the story, but I didn't want to talk to them. I just wanted to feel the sun on my face, breathe air that didn't smell like betrayal and old wood polish. Wanted to tell Eleanor, wherever she was, that I'd kept my promise, I'd watched out for myself. When we went back in, the judge didn't take long, guilty on all counts. Sentences to be determined, but jail time certain. Restitution ordered, though they had nothing left to give. Restraining orders issued. They could never come near me again, never contact me, never darken my door. The house they'd tried to steal would be sold, the proceeds going to their victims. Meaning me, though I'd already decided every penny would go to charity. But the real judgment came when the judge addressed them directly. Called their actions a betrayal of the deepest trust, an assault on the bonds that hold families and society together. said that elder abuse was a cancer eating away at our obligation to honor those who came before us. Her words fell on them like stones, each one true, each one heavy. Loretta cried, Clyde just stared at his hands. As they were led away, Clyde turned one last time. Our eyes met across that courtroom, father and son, strangers now. I searched his face for remorse, for understanding, for anything of the boy I'd raised. But all I saw was a man calculating how this had gone wrong, already planning his next move, his next mark. The son I'd loved was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. What stood there was just a hollow man who'd sold his soul for money he'd never touch. Outside, Abram asked if I was all right. Strange question, really. Was I all right? My only child had tried to destroy me. The family I'd built was shattered beyond repair. The house I'd shared with Eleanor would soon belong to strangers, but I was free. I was vindicated. I was still standing. So, yes, I supposed I was all right as a man could be who'd won a war he never wanted to fight. The reporters wanted a statement, but I didn't have words for them. How do you explain a lifetime of love turned to ash? How do you describe the weight of betrayal by your own blood? How do you sum up the loss of everything you thought you knew about your own life? I just shook my head and walked away, Abram's hand steady on my elbow, guiding me through the crowd. That night, back at Mrs. Gable's, we sat on her porch again. She'd made tea, the good kind, and we watched fireflies dance in the gathering dark. Neither of us mentioned the trial, the verdict, the future. Just sat there, two old souls who'd seen too much, finding comfort in silence and companionship. Sometimes that's all you need, someone who understands that some wounds don't need words. But as I headed to bed, I stopped by the mirror in her hallway. The man looking back at me was older than the one who'd started this journey, lined by battles he'd never asked for. But his eyes were clear, his shoulders were straight. He'd faced down the worst betrayal a parent could know and survived. Otis Harlan was blooded but not broken, and tomorrow he'd start figuring out what came next. The war was over, but the peace was just beginning. And peace, I was learning, could be just as hard as war. But at least now I could face it on my own terms, in my own time, with whatever dignity I had left. The ghosts of what had been would always haunt me, but they wouldn't define me. I was more than just a father betrayed, more than just an old man wronged. I was a survivor, and that would have to be enough. 6 months after the trial, I was sitting in my new place, a modest apartment downtown, nothing fancy but mine and mine alone, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting nobody, and for a moment, old fears stirred. But when I opened the door, there stood a young woman, maybe 30, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. She looked familiar in a way I couldn't place, until she smiled. That smile hit me like lightning. It was Eleanor's smile, the same one that had captured my heart all those years ago. Her voice shook when she spoke, asking if I was Otis Harlan, if Clyde was my son. When I nodded, unable to find words, she said something that changed everything. Clyde had another family, had a whole other life I never knew about, 3 states over. This was Sarah, the woman he'd abandoned when she got pregnant, left her with nothing but promises and debt. And this little boy, standing there with eyes the same green as Eleanor's, this was Matthew. My grandson, a grandson I never knew existed. I invited them in, made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Sarah told me the story, how she'd met Clyde at a conference, how he'd been charming and attentive, how he'd never mentioned a wife. When she told him about the baby, he'd disappeared. She'd raised Matthew alone, struggling but managing, never asking for anything from the man who'd left them behind. She'd seen the news about the trial, recognized Clyde's picture, realized who he really was. Spent months debating whether to reach out, worried I might be like him, might reject them too. But something, maybe desperation or maybe hope, had brought her to my door. Matthew needed surgery, she explained, something with his heart. Insurance would cover most of it, but not all. She wasn't asking for money, she said quickly, just wanted Matthew to know he had family, wanted him to have roots before the surgery in case. I looked at that little boy, really looked at him. He had Eleanor's eyes, her gentle way of tilting his head when he was thinking. But more than that, he had her spirit. I could see it in how he held his mother's hand, protective even at 5 years old. Here was my blood, my real legacy, standing in my living room like a gift from beyond. Without hesitation, I told Sarah everything would be taken care of. Not just the surgery, but everything else too. School, college, whatever they needed. The money I'd planned to give away anyway had just found its purpose. But more than money, I offered them family, real family. The kind that shows up, that stays, that loves without conditions or calculations. Over the next weeks, I got to know my grandson. He was bright as a penny, curious about everything, gentle with animals and rough with toys the way boys should be. He called me Grandpa Otis right from the start, like he'd been waiting his whole life to say it. We'd sit on my little balcony, and I'd tell him stories about the shop, about cars and tools and fixing things. His eyes would light up the same way Clyde's used to, back before everything went wrong. Sarah was a revelation too. Strong where Loretta was weak, kind where she was cruel, honest where my daughter-in-law had been nothing but lies. She worked 2 jobs, went to night school, never complained. When I offered to help with expenses, she cried, not from greed, but from relief. She'd been carrying the load alone for so long, the idea of help was almost too much to bear. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday in September. I sat in that hospital waiting room, Sarah's hand in mine, and prayed like I hadn't prayed since Eleanor's last day. Begged God for one more chance, one more gift, one more generation to get it right. When the surgeon came out smiling, saying everything had gone perfectly, I felt Eleanor's presence so strong I could almost see her. Matthew recovered like the fighter he was. Within weeks, he was running around my apartment, leaving toy cars everywhere, filling the silence with laughter I'd thought I'd never hear again. Sarah found a better job, started cutting back her hours to spend more time with him. They moved into a house nearby, nothing fancy, but with a yard for Matthew and room for a garden. We planted roses that next spring, not Eleanor's varieties, those were gone forever, but new ones. Matthew picked them out, drawn to the bright yellows and deep purples. We dug in the dirt together, his small hands next to my old ones, planting beauty for the future. Sarah took pictures, said she wanted Matthew to remember this, remember us together, remember love. One evening, as we sat on their porch watching Matthew chase fireflies, Sarah asked about Clyde. What had he been like as a boy? What had he changed? Could I forgive him? Hard questions with harder answers. I told her the truth, that I'd loved my son, that I'd failed him somehow, that I'd probably never understand where we went wrong. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was Matthew, was breaking the chain, was making sure this boy grew up knowing he was loved and valued and enough. The fortune I'd built, the one Clyde had tried to steal, it had a purpose now. Not just charity, though I still gave plenty away. But a trust for Matthew, for his education, his future, his dreams. For Sarah, too, this woman who'd raised my grandson alone, who'd given him values Clyde never learned. They were my family now, chosen not by blood alone, but by love and loyalty and showing up. Clyde never knew about them. He was serving his time, would be for years to come. Loretta had divorced him, moved away, disappeared into whatever life she could salvage. Part of me wondered if I should tell him about Matthew, but Sarah asked me not to. He'd abandoned them once, she said. He didn't deserve to know what he'd thrown away. And she was right. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. As for the house, our old house, it sold to a young family with 3 kids. I drove by once, saw roses blooming in Eleanor's garden again, different but beautiful. Saw children playing in the yard, heard laughter floating from the porch. The house was alive again, filled with the joy it deserved. The ghosts were at rest. My life at 83 is nothing like I'd imagined it would be. It's been over a year now since that trial ended, more than 18 months since they first changed the locks on my door. I thought I'd grow old with Eleanor, thought Clyde would give us grandchildren we'd spoil together, thought we'd have Sunday dinners and holiday traditions and all the normal things families have. Instead, I'd been betrayed, abandoned, nearly destroyed. But from those ashes had come something unexpected, a second chance, a new family, a love I hadn't known I was missing. Matthew starts school next year. He wants to learn about cars, wants Grandpa Otis to teach him everything. Sarah's graduating with her degree, planning a future she'd never dared dream about. And me, I wake up every morning with purpose again. Not just surviving, but living. Not just existing, but mattering to people who matter to me. Sometimes, late at night, I talk to Eleanor. Tell her about Matthew, about how he has her eyes and her smile and her way of finding joy in small things. Tell her about Sarah, the daughter we never had, strong and good and devoted. Tell her that despite everything, because of everything, we'd won. Not the life we'd planned, but maybe the life we were meant to have. The Bible says God works in mysterious ways, and I believe it now more than ever. What Clyde and Loretta meant for evil, God turned to good. The family they tried to destroy was reborn stronger, truer, built on choice rather than chance. The money they tried to steal became a blessing for people who deserved it. The man they tried to bury became a grandfather, a father figure, a pillar of strength for souls who needed him. I don't know how many years I've got left. At my age, every sunrise is a gift, every healthy day a small miracle. But however many I get, they'll be spent loving and being loved, building and growing, making up for lost time. Matthew needs to know his history, needs to hear about Eleanor and the roses and the shop and all of it. Sarah needs a father, the kind who shows up and stays. And me, I need them both more than I ever knew. This isn't the ending I expected to my story. It's better. It's proof that life can surprise you right up to the end, that love can find you when you least expect it, that family isn't just about blood, but about choice. Clyde chose greed and got nothing. I chose love and got everything. And somewhere up there, I know Eleanor's smiling, knowing her Otis finally found his way home. So, if you're listening to this, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, remember something, it ain't over till it's over. You might be in your darkest hour, betrayed by those you trusted most, alone and afraid and wondering what's the point. But hold on, keep fighting, stay true to who you are. Because sometimes, just when you think the story's ending, a new chapter begins. And sometimes, that chapter is the best one of all. God bless you for listening to an old man's tale. And if you've got family that loves you, really loves you, hold them tight. Tell them every day, don't wait for tomorrow. Because family, real family, that's the only fortune that matters in the end. Take it from someone who lost it all and found it again in the most unexpected places. Love is always worth the risk, always.